wanted to talk a little bit about Dogme and textbooks because the two are quite closely linked, but I'm not going to spend the talk deconstructing Dogme. This was very much well covered during last year's session here at the conference, particularly when Luke and Jeremy engaged both charmingly and with passion and with great good grace, which is characteristic of some, if not many, of the Dogme people. Some of my best friends are Dogme people, dogmatists, or whatever you want to call them. But there is a group of them who, you know, well, I call them the provisional wing of the dogmatists. They're sort of, they'll get you late at night, you know. There's quite a lot of tough language about textbooks. And I'm a fairly relaxed, fairly, you know, sort of easygoing kind of person. Professionally, though, I work very hard at my work. I'm very, very proud of being a textbook writer. And I also realized last October that I'd actually spent 30 years as a textbook writer. And so while I also realize in my old age that I don't know very much about very much, I think I do know quite a lot about textbook writing, which is why I've called the talk How to Write a Textbook, How Textbooks Work. And the Dogma thing is really just to have a look at the Dogma difficulty with materials like teaching. And as I say, I'm not going to go into great detail about the criticisms because I think there is one very, very good thing about Dogma and indeed Scott Thornbury is going to talk about it this year in the IH Barcelona conference, how Dogme, for whatever its good and its contribution to ELT, it has been incredibly thought-provoking in CPD. And while my work has very little, if not nothing to do with actual Dogme techniques or anything like that, I certainly find that the presence of Dogma allows me to reflect about the work that I do, which is very, very different. I'm going to look at these points. These points are really going to be the shape of this talk. I hope I'm certainly going to get through them all because the talk won't make sense if I don't get through them all. It's just some of them I may go through rather quickly. So these are thoughts that have occurred to me while I do my day job. My day job is when I sit on my own writing textbooks. Most of my work, well, my work in the past until about 2000 was in international textbook writing. And I traveled all over the world. I came to many, many IH schools who were considering adopting some of my books. And then I got kind of shanghaied, kind of hijacked to work on ministry projects. And I'm going to focus a little bit on my work on ministry projects just to show you what is beyond the private language school sector, the kind of thing that really makes our work so important. And how does this relate to Dogme? Well, what I'm trying to say is that I think Dogme has important insights in teaching and how to acquire language. I just think that there is something that is a little bit more than that that's going on. I think we have responsibilities that go beyond just helping students to learn to speak the language or to write the language. And I'm going to come back to that, but it's to do with the issue of professionalism and accountability. I'm very pleased that Keith Morrow talked about accountability. This whole idea of how our profession, when I began, was more or less, you know, the backpacker kind of career, and has now become something that is so important, is so significant to people all over the world. And I'm going to be looking at some particular comments about that. The first one that I'm going to have a quick look at is the textbook criticisms and survival. I've done a talk recently on the criticisms to textbooks, and I don't really want to go back over them again. If any of you attended my online conference, that was quite a lot of the criticisms about textbooks that I incorporated in that talk. There's no problem in finding other criticisms about textbooks, and I'm actually interested to show you one by a colleague of mine. I've just made this slide to introduce the kind of anger that sometimes people have when more mindless course books are published, and where's the emergent language? I'm going to be talking a little bit about emergent language as well. Mario Rimvalukri, who's now more or less retired from the profession, had this incredible influence on us during the 80s and 90s in particular. And I kind of see him as the proto-Dogme specialist. He made this intriguing comment about, have you ever thought of writing a coursebook? Financially, of course, but never seriously. I firmly believe that what happens in my class arises from the meeting between the students and me, and the students and each other. Now, this is a pretty Dogme kind of position. And indeed, that's where the emergent language comes from. That's where the language that the students need in order to take advantage of that meeting is then exploited and turned into acquired language or an outcome or whatever you want to call the result of a Dogme lesson. How rationally can any outside person map this meeting out in advance? Suppose you go to have dinner with a few friends. Do you arrive with a prearranged conversation script? A course book is as daft and off course as that. Feeling this, how could I contemplate writing one? I think the comparison with the dinner party conversation is a little bit not terribly useful. There are some things which you prepare, and there are other things that you don't prepare in life. I suspect that English language is something that you can either prepare or don't have to prepare. But I don't think it's one thing or the other. I think a Dogme position will be, let's wing it, let's see how it goes. I think my position is that I would want to make absolutely sure that in respect of the professional requirements of my customers, that I want to prepare it as carefully as possible. And things like dinner party conversations don't really come into this. Another Mario comment was a wonderful rant here. Ambition, rage, jealousy, betrayal, destiny, greed, fear, and the other Shakespearean themes are far from the soft, fudgy, sub-journalistic woman's magazine-y world of EFLE's course materials. So if you ever imagine what I do, you can imagine me sitting in my frilly pajamas just writing magazine. Awfully sexist, actually, but let's keep quiet about that. Mario was one of these, I can't say was, is one of these people who always makes you think. And this is the Dogme thing. It makes you think. And no, I don't agree with this. And no, I don't agree with many of the things that are proposed in a Dogme approach, or whatever you want to call it. But it makes me think, and that's a good thing. Let's move on to the other main point there, that the point that ELT has life-changing responsibilities. And this is something that I'm passionate about, and I'm going to be spending a lot of this talk trying to explore. There was some recent research by the British Council, and no doubt others, that indicates an awareness of a salary gap between those who speak English and those who don't. Now, I'm stating the obvious. When you have certain professional skills, you can hope to acquire a better salary, a better post in your work, and so on and so forth. And in the developing world, there's a need to communicate with the rest of the world in order to attract investment. So this is not just doesn't just have an effect on the learner, the language learner's potential salary, it has an effect on the internal trade and economy of the countries in which that student is going to operate. And this is where I'm wanting to take our work out of the classroom. I want us, although we are classroom bound, we do operate in a complex world, and our responsibilities are huge. This investment that language learning attracts, it creates a virtuous circle where increasing investment drives a need for English speakers, which in turn has a beneficial effect on the wealth of the individual and the state in which he or she works. And this continues in an upward spiral. And many of the examples that I'm going to talk about today, particularly for my work in China and Palestine, the concept, the understanding of how our work contributes to the economic development and the health of the country is clearer and clearer. And these are ideas which are enshrined in curriculum documents all over the world. Curriculum documents that we don't necessarily see when we're in the classroom, but things that we probably do see amongst directors of studies, because you have your school missions, and particularly in IH, where we're aware of a certain drive and a certain mission that we have. The curriculum is very, very important to reflect the importance of the economic health and development of the country. It's not just a phenomenon of the developing world, I have to say. In Switzerland, it's been estimated that if you have basic skills in English, you add 16% to your salary. And if you have outstanding skills in English, you can add up to 50% to your salary. So there are objectives for English study which are beyond, I was going to say learning to use the present perfect, but I dare say in Dogme you don't do that. There are objectives beyond simply acquiring the language. You need to acquire the language in order to improve your career prospects. You need to expand the social circle in which you work. You need to prepare for English tests to study abroad. That's a very, very important objective. And you may need to get professional qualifications, either internal ones or national qualifications to act as interpreters or whatever, or external ones like the Cambridge exams or whatever. And employers are looking for employees who are aware of these objectives and are willing to invest in their own education, either while they're looking for work or when they have jobs. So the point that I'm trying to make is that we are contributing to an extremely complex and and we have extraordinary responsibilities in this whole development, life-changing results that we can have on the users of English. Above all, there's this primary motivation to escape from poverty, for better salaries and jobs, and encouragement for career advancement. And all this, of course, if you earn more, though you get taxed more, the tax base is increased, and therefore there is more to do with that money to reinvest in the country itself. So those kind of things are actually quite important. Now, I'm not, of course, saying that Dogme and textbooks don't contribute to this. I'm just trying to say that put what we do in a context of a complex model which is potentially life-changing. It has extraordinary responsibilities. The work that I've been doing in China has been particularly important, and I want to show you this Ministry of Education curriculum document, the so-called structure of course objectives. I actually used this slide when I spoke at the IH Directors of Studies Conference about 5 or 6 years ago. I'm taking a risk that some of you weren't here. The reason I like this document is that for me it's the clearest summary of the curriculum. in the public school system, at least in China. But I think it's relevant to all the work we do, to our curriculum, to a lesser or greater extent. And this has always been the clearest and most succinct expression of how all these things cooperate. Our traditional concern, up until relatively recently, was about language knowledge. It was about phonology, it was about grammar, it was about vocabulary, it was about functions, kind of newish, mid-1970s, functions came in as a way of describing language, and the topics that needed to be covered. Very often those topics will act as macro lexical fields. They will group the lexis that you need to teach. But this is something that, you know, our work has been quite restricted to. And then gradually in the 1970s and 80s, much more work was done on language skills. And this is also reflected in the fact that in many countries there's greater demand on more holistic language skills of showing of how to use the language. And exams will not just be grammar-based blank fills or vocabulary tests, but they will also be tests about how to read well and how to listen well and how to speak and write well. So the language skills and the language knowledge in my time, say 30 years in the ELT, has been very largely dominated by those two little sectors there. But all of a sudden, when the ministries, rightly so in my mind, the ministers' officials come to the UK and get their MAs in TEFL or whatever, and then they go back and they come up with these documents. And actually, many of these documents are really good. And they come up with things like learning strategy, cultural consciousness, and affect and attitude. The learning strategies, I'm not quite sure how I characterize those in my work as a textbook writer. They're kind of dealt with in a more holistic way rather than an atomistic way. They're kind of things to do with making the learner much more conscious about how they learn, what they need to do to improve their learning, how to organize vocabulary, how to use a dictionary, the kind of learner training skills that we cover. Communication strategies as well would be just simply ways of making yourself understood, sometimes with minimal language. And so learning strategy is one area that has been introduced relatively recently. This document, by the way, dates from about 2001, when the Chinese were reforming their schools' language curriculum. And this is the document that we've been working with since then. And this is pretty well every day I look at this thing and try and work out how I can meet those objectives, because actually it's not that I feel I have to meet them. I actually think they're quite good objectives. Cultural consciousness is an interesting one that we've developed greatly over the recent years. Sociocultural awareness, intercultural competence is now very much part of our mainstream course work in classes. It's also something that is developed in a more holistic way as well. It's not just the issue of talking about a target culture such as Britain or America or possibly Australia. It's to do with being aware that you use language in different cultural contexts and with different purposes, and that your cultural background can be affected in different ways by the way your language is perceived by somebody from a different culture. You may be having relatively few language difficulties, but you may be having difficulties in communicating because of cultural issues. And so this is an area which we've developed greatly, particularly in the last, well, I'd say the last 20 years, when this has become an overt syllabus strand in many course books and in many curricula. One of the, yes, there's one note here. Of course, one of the issues here is whether these objectives are actually testable. And this is an area where I think we do have to, sometimes we have difficulties of understanding with our Dogme friends when we talk about testing. They don't want to be tested at the end of the lesson. They don't want to worry about things like, they just want to be able to help their students express themselves. That's fine, but unfortunately the real world, as enshrined in a ministry document, does want you to test things. And very often things are not taught quite so successfully because they can't be tested. And they can't be tested very often for very practical reasons. Sometimes, for example, in Palestine, where I work, there are problems of simply moving exam papers around the country, problems of exam security. In China, it's a huge country, so getting exam papers around the place is, once again, quite difficult, even if the lines of communication are available. Of course, digital technology is allowing us to develop this, but it's still, there's still this problem of the testing, which I'm going to come back to. But the thing that I find most interesting in this document is this whole area of affect and attitudes, motivation, confidence, team working, national commitment, and international vision. And when you're working with the PES, the public education sector, these are really very, very important. This is probably something which is less overt in the private language sector, the kind of work that we do in IH. But I think it's worth talking about this because it's all part of our objectives in the language class, as I said earlier, to a lesser or greater extent. I love this whole idea about national commitment and international vision. I'm going to read some of the extracts from the ministry documents to show how our work is not just defined and positioned only in the classroom. Our work is actually for a greater purpose. Sound rather messianical here, but it's got a much more important role. And sometimes I feel that this is overlooked when we're just looking at teaching techniques and how to teach effectively. So before we leave this document, as I say, this is something that I work with pretty well every day. It's very, very important to the work I do, and I refer to it. I don't necessarily think that I deal with each objective in an atomistic way. I think there's a lot that brings it together, and that is where the science of textbook writing becomes an art, to get all those different objectives working together successfully. I talked a little bit about target and sample culture. I think I'll move on because I'm aware that time is getting on. Yeah, just reading some of the extracts from the Chinese ministry document. Let's go back to this one. Today's world is in the trend of multipolarization, economic globalization, and informatization. English has become the principal tool to enhance international exchange as well as scientific and cultural exchanges. Establishing an English language course in the compulsory education stage is conducive to laying a solid foundation for improving the overall qualities of our people, cultivating talent with innovative and cross-cultural capabilities, and enhancing international competitiveness of China and the communications, this is a long sentence, communication skills of its people. Learning English not only helps them better to understand the world, to acquire advanced, specific and scientific cultural knowledge, spread Chinese culture, etc., etc. Learning English can help them to cultivate the character of openness and tolerance, develop an awareness and a capability for cross-cultural communication. All these kind of things are actually very important in the syllabus, in the curriculum documents. And we've got to somehow meet these objectives in the course books that we provide for our workers. Interesting, when I first arrived in China, I'm still the Western specialist, the front man of this cross-publisher project. And the wish was very much strongly on the Chinese part to tell the world more about China. This was a very specific request because the Chinese have tended to feel, and rightly so, that the world doesn't know very much about them. And they want to. This was the lead up to the Olympic Games. They wanted to be respected and judged fairly, I would say more fairly than perhaps they are in the world, everywhere in the world. And my point was, yes, that's perfectly valid, but I think you also need to make the world more, make China more aware of what goes on in the world. And this kind of combination of looking out and looking in became terribly important to the work we were doing. And I think it was a nuance that hadn't occurred to our Chinese friends and colleagues. And I'm very proud that this kind of balance between the looking out and the looking in was achieved in the textbooks that we produced for the Chinese. School children will be living and contributing to an increasingly independent community of nations. There we go. Internationalism is the hallmark of modern education. Linguistic and cultural diversity, the hallmarks of internationalism. And so on and so forth. There's a lot of these comments here about placing English in the function towards building the Palestine state. And this is what I keep saying. Our work is not just defined and restricted to the course book and the classroom. It goes far, far beyond there. So I'm going to move on to the next of the third points because I realize that as time goes on, we've got less and less opportunity to explore all these. I'm going to talk a little bit about this issue of complex problems and complex solutions. Writing a textbook is something that's very, very complex. And I don't like the idea that it is regarded as something that is simple and that gets in the way of effective teaching. It's a very complex thing. I'm going to try and go through some of the issues that I have to consider when I'm putting a textbook together. This is the heart of this talk, how textbooks work. I don't see why something that is complex, like English language teaching, should make a virtue of making it simple. Now, I'm not saying that dogme practice is an oversimplification of something. I think there is a time and place for dogme techniques anywhere. But I don't think that we should take a source of pride from the fact that something complex, like English language learning and teaching, is somehow suspect and should be made simple. I think there are more things that we can do. These are some of the issues that I'm going to skip through. The course design for me is at the very heart of the document. It's heavily defined by the publisher and the brief that we get from whoever we're writing from, either other publishers, as we have done in China, or the Ministry of Education itself. The course design is usually based on a multi-syllabus course design. This is my job to bring all these different these syllabuses to work together. So we're covering things like language knowledge and language skills and the culture and affect and all the different things that I mentioned on the chart that I showed you. I talk about organizing or principal syllabuses. These are the syllabuses to which there is some kind of order. They provide some organization to the order in which we teach things. Now, these are the grammar McNuggets, if you like, that Scott Thornbury detests. And I understand where he comes from. I'm very happy with his insights on this. Unfortunately, I just have to get on and deal with grammar McNuggets. I am your grammar McNugget man. I'm Ronald McGrammar, whatever. I just have to deal with them. And these organizing and principal syllabuses usually involve the topics, the lexis, because those two are very closely linked. We have to cover certain topics in order to cover certain lexis. And we have to cover certain grammar and certain functions. And ideally, in a course book, all of those need to fit neatly together. So we can't do, as one of my Chinese colleagues said, the grammar function of future continuous with a passage with the content of the topic of Shakespeare and the function of apologizing. We can't do that. We have to sort of make sure they all operate together. Moving on, the supplementary syllabuses. Of course, we can have a very extensive list. I call them supplementary not because they aren't important, but they're not the organizing ones which which have an effect on the order in which we do things, we teach things. So all of these have their own micro-syllabuses, and in another time, another place, and a bit more time, I probably would talk about them as well, but we won't have that. The publisher's brief is essential. Knowing how to interpret it and have multiple suggestions to meet the brief is also essential. That's my job, to make sure that I have lots and lots of different ideas. They say, well, we want this course that's to meet the needs of high school learners who are starting out to have a little bit of pair work, a little bit of communicative methodology, but not too much. And I said, okay, you can do it this way, you can do it that way, you can do it that way, and you can do it that way. These are 4 ways that I can think of. And gradually we talk and choose the one approach that we want. The grammar syllabus, as I've said, is usually specified. It's the one thing that appears in most curriculum documents. You usually know what grammar McNuggets you've got to cover. But there is an assumption that they should be taught in order, and the natural order of grammar. Somewhere like China is actually indicated by the natural order that those items were originally taught in Russian, or when the choice of modern languages in China was either Russian or English. And that was partly due to the close friendship between Russia and China, and the fact that their political empathy allowed them to get textbooks in China from the Russians. And so the Russian order of grammar actually has, to a large extent, become the Chinese order of grammar of English. Lots and lots of history, lots and lots of things going on here. We need a methodology or an approach which is usually communicative. We have to consider the classroom interaction. We have to develop pair work. We have to think about the information gap. Have to think about content-rich material, learner-centered teaching and learning, and decide whether prescriptive or descriptive approaches to, say, for example, grammar are appropriate. And we've discovered that actually there's much more tolerance these days about descriptive or discovery approaches to grammar surprisingly, even in school systems which are being fairly slow about not adopting new ideas. Where do these words come from? The words that we teach. My work in Palestine actually has obliged me to be prescriptive about where these words come from, because one of the problems when we did our first series in Palestine was that our books were I think probably okay, but when they came to the exam test, they didn't test what had been taught. And I came to the conclusion that actually I wanted to have a hand on the words that were actually going to be taught. Now, it doesn't mean to say that other words cannot be learnt by the students. It just means that the words that are tested will be in a lexicon. They will be the lexical syllabus. And I'm at work at the moment trying to decide one by one which of these words are the right words to teach and which are not. Now, this is a complete and utter anathema to the Dogme people and the emergent language principle. I'm sorry, I just have to do it because there is more at stake. That's the thing I'm coming back to all the time. I have to do things that maybe Dogme people don't like me doing, but I'm pragmatic about having to do those kind of things. I sit and wonder every day about words, about which words to include, and the principles behind all of that. I sit and wonder also about issues of meaning, of contextualization, of integration, of the idea of communicative activity sequences, where one activity is justified by what precedes it, and another activity justifies what follows it. So you have this cohesion of ideas and activities, all of which create their own communicative context. That's my job. There are other issues here about textbooks which are less relevant to the classrooms, but they're things also I have to get involved in. There's the whole issue of layout and space and design, white space, how much white space we allow on the textbook. Some ministries like students to take notes on the books. Other ministries don't want the children to write in the books, make notes, because they use those books for the following year. So we have to take decisions there. We have to talk about the distinction between cosmetic and functional artwork. Cosmetic is pictures that just look nice. Functional ones that have some role to play in the teaching. And I tend personally not to like textbooks which have lots of little pictures because I think they look bitty. And there's another reason which I'll talk about in a minute. We're also concerned about issues like the typeface, and which I think in other terms we would refer to as the font, but the typeface is the correct term in publishing for the different typefaces, the different fonts that you have in your computer programs. And the point size, if we're teaching particularly for East Asia, we need to have slightly larger text, about a couple of point sizes larger for younger learners from Japan than we might do for people who are learning English who've got who use the Roman alphabet. The yield is very important to me as well, how much language a particular activity generates and how much space it takes up. In the classroom, we're defined by time, the 35 minutes or the 40 minutes or the 1 hour of the lesson, of the duration of the lesson. And the textbook, we're defined by that, but we're also defined by space. Time and space are the important things. So the yield of the activity is important. We also have to consider whether we're teaching to an exam syllabus and whether we should be looking at exam-oriented preparation or exam-specific preparation. And that's terribly important. Content is important as well. I'm going to quickly slip through those. You can imagine what's going on there. The content, a lot of textbooks these days are really good about content. They make a special effort to choose interesting passages. I won't go into favourite course books at the moment because that would be invidious. Everybody will have certain textbooks that you like more or less for the content. But it's terribly, terribly important because it contributes to the motivation that our students have. And the book plan is something that we need to discuss, the teaching units or the textbook lessons, whether we call a lesson in the textbook the same as the lesson in the classroom. Sometimes we don't, and so it gets a bit confusing. We have to decide about review units, what goes at the beginning of the book, which we call prelims, the end matter, what goes at the end of the book. As I say, distinguish between textbook lessons and classroom lessons. So all of these are factors which we have to consider. This is a longer issue, which I'm clearly not going to cover successfully. Publishers and profits. A lot of people are very suspicious about publishers making money, and I'm just going to tackle this quickly, although it's worth an hour in itself. This was Luke Medding's comment way, way, way back, 8 years ago. Accepting and reinforcing this state of psychological affairs, the disempowerment of the non-native speaker teacher, is a handy way for publishers to ensure that the standardized native speaker versions of English remain the status quo. It's called protecting your profit margin. Basically, publishers run business, and they're actually quite open about the need to make money. But actually, language schools need to be run well. Organisations like IHWO need to be run well, and indeed are run well. Lucy's in the front row here, so I have to say that. We are concerned. We depend on our organisation being financially viable for the sake of our jobs. We have to do it. So there's no point in saying filthy lucre, publishers just cream off all the money. The publishers, this was another comment that was made to me in an ELT Jack. Coursebook writers, the arms dealers of the ELT profession. Well, I'm a nice guy, you know, really. This poor woman actually didn't realise that I was in the discussion. And I said, I'm honest, I work hard, and I think very carefully about my customers, which is actually the point about this talk. She was terribly embarrassed and apologized very much to me later. But it's kind of feeling that there's something louche, that French word louche, rather questionable about the whole publishing industry. Publishing is actually not generating the amount of money that it used to. No time at all to go through all these different points, but basically this is a diagram that shows you where the money goes. Very briefly, the author gets around a royalty of, it kind of averages out at about 8.77. This will depend on the type of books and the numbers of books that, the numbers of copies that are sold over the lifetime. The publisher actually ends up with a profit of about 10%. So very closely, the author and the publisher get more or less the same amount, earn the same amount from a passage, from a textbook. The rest has radically changed over the years, and sales and marketing and distribution actually are far more important and far more generate far more cost than editorial and anything else. And the reason for this is that publishers these days have to work much, much harder to meet markets, the market demands. The market is fragmented quite considerably. That's probably a good thing. The great days of the big blockbuster books like Headway and even the ones that preceded it are no longer the case today. There's much more market fragmentation, and it's partly due to the digital technological revolution. So all publishing is finding its way in this uncertain age at the moment. But I do want to stress, and I can prove it if I had more than 5 minutes, I can prove that publishers are very aware of their responsibilities in the same way as I'm aware and you're aware of our responsibilities to our customer. And actually, they're not a license to print money anymore. It may have been the case in the past, although even then I don't think so. Somebody also wrote, this is the Dogme Yahoo list, which if anybody is a member of this is quite an interesting ongoing discussion, an ad hoc discussion about Dogme. Do you think you would have written what you've written if you hadn't been obliged to do so by your publishers? This was a question that was asked of me when I came clean about who I was, and I was lurking. And I was kind of really jaw-dropped at this, that somebody could have thought that I was spending 30 years of my life just doing what my publisher told me. I actually believe what I'm doing. I really do believe what I'm doing. And I wouldn't dream of just doing something because my publisher tells me to do it. So, it's actually very, very important. Looking at these main principles, I'll try and get through all of these. Textbooks and good teachers. Dogme has presented itself on occasion as this sort of pedagogical state of grace to which all teachers should aspire. And that would mean eschewing textbooks, doing things really with minimal materials, minimal technology, and so on and so forth. The thing is that the number of teachers who are actually trained in this this kind of skill is really very, very small. The estimate is of about 1.5 billion learners of English around the world, and 11.5 million teachers of English in the public education sector and the PLS, the private language schools. So that's the total number of English language teachers around the world. 90% of these teachers are non-native, and amongst the largest number of those who use textbooks, approximately 200,000 in the private language sector. That's to say the maximum number of Dogme approach teachers who are out there amongst you, lurking. Approximately 100,000 are CELTA or Delta trained. So this means that the public education sector is huge in comparison to, well, frankly, the work that we do. And it's the public education sector which is doing an awful lot in still perpetuating the need for course books. Many, I would say most teachers around the world will use course books because the English language curriculum prescribed by the ministry is complex and they need help to work out how to understand it. That's my job. I interpret the complex ministry objectives into something that can be used reliably and in good faith in the classroom. That's my job. That's why I've been working on this for 30 years. Comments that have been made by my friend Chan Swan Chung, who used to work with us at IH London. If that's my mother, say hi. Course books don't just dominate the teachers' lives, they dominate the students' lives too. And this is something that's regarded as a criticism. And Scott also, in his wonderfully brilliant A to Z of ELT, said that the reason that course books are so often in the line of fire is that they do, to a large extent, dominate and determine so many aspects of the teacher's day-to-day professional life. They, more often as not, instantiate the curriculum, provide the text, and to a large extent, guide the methodology. Well, yes, Scott, I agree, but you'd see that as a bad thing. I see that as a good thing. That's really where we kind of differ. Or I see it as a good thing in many occasions. I don't think that it's explicitly a bad thing. Obviously not, because I wouldn't be standing here. We have this kind of pact with our students. There are all sorts, not just our students, but all sorts of people who are stakeholders in language teaching. There's not just the students and the teachers, and actually Dogme is talking directly to students and teachers, but we have a responsibility to the resources and methodology that we use. There are directors of studies like yourself who have an idea of what good practice in ELT means. There are head teachers and school owners who have an idea of how they want their school to be run. There are parents in the work that I do. There are employers who want to know that they're getting people with the right language skills. There's people coming up with third-party funding. It could be the employers, it could be the human resources department, it could be any source. It could be a charity, whatever. There are exams and exam boards, or the Ministry of Education, all of whom have a stake in this whole industry. And what I'm trying to say is that they're just blaming textbooks, as has been the case, for not maintaining standards in English language teaching seems to me to be unfair. If you have a problem, and I'm not even saying there is a problem, but if you have a problem, look at the whole system. Don't just try and reform one aspect of it. You've got to do this holistically. You've got to see all of these people, all of these so-called stakeholders, as belonging to the same ecosystem in which they all have an individual part. And that, for me, is something that is part of our responsibilities as language teachers, as directors of studies, and textbook writers, methodologists, everybody that works in the business. So just finally, to finish off here, my concern is with the so-called pragma aspect of this, is to come up with a pragmatic response. Pragme is just my not very funny joke of response. That what I'm trying to say is that we have enormous responsibilities. ELT has enormous life-changing responsibilities, and I think we need to be pragmatic and not, and I won't make the pun dogmatic, but you get the idea. We have to be pragmatic. These are what I call the pragma doctrine. Teachers need our help. This is, by the way, this is a takeoff of the three pillars, the three tenets of Dogme, so it's not very funny. Teachers need our help. They don't need to feel disempowered or downgraded by the devices they use to help them, for example, technology. These are things that I really, really believe in. Teachers need to adapt to learners' needs, and are the mark of good teaching. It doesn't really matter what methodology they do, as long as it's the right one for the circumstances. Teaching for exams or a formal curriculum is a reality for many teachers. It's not teaching in inferior circumstances. So don't assume that teaching without Dogme teaching in a Dogme style is this higher state of pedagogical grace. That's not fair on everything else that's going on. Teachers need approaches and methodologies which are appropriate to their cultural context. And I'm quite sure many of you with experience of outside the private language school, or the private language sector, will know that you have to adapt yourself to your cultural context and the conditions, the teaching conditions in which you find yourself. Teachers don't teach in ideal circumstances. My books are prepared in China for classes of 60 plus people. So, you know, you can imagine doing a Dogme class with 60 people. It's just, you know, it's a question of management. Textbooks are quite often used for management purposes. Teachers need to be encouraged to use their own instinct, training, and emotional sensibility and intelligence to provide an honest response to their students' needs by whatever means they use. Oh, why does that go? Okay. Common sense and basic good instinct need to prevail. And dogmatic principles need to yield to pragmatic awareness of the huge variation in teaching circumstances. We cannot afford to give them but anything but the very best and most complete facilities and training. So that's really where I'm up to. These are the 7 points that I've made, which include in the final point the pragma part of this talk. Just to come back to the issue that I raised in the beginning, somebody said that the last thing to survive after the bomb will be the cockroach. I would like to suggest the last thing to survive after the bomb will be the cockroach and the course book, because you can't blow it up. It's been around for years, and there must be a reason for it. And I think in the same way as Dogme allows me to think carefully about my work, as I hope I've proved today, how Dogme allows me to do that, that textbooks allow them to do the same. Frankly, they need to hate us, because otherwise they wouldn't have anything to kick against. Thank you very much.